My father left me a house as an inheritance, and my mother's new boyfriend tried to sue me for it when I was 16 years old. I've always hated how Michael looked at the house, my house, like he owned it. Let me back up. My dad passed away when I was 8. That day rewrote everything. The house we lived in, a modest but cozy place with its creaky stairs and the faint smell of pine wood, became my only connection to him. He left it to me, not to Mom, not to both of us, just me. I didn't get that at first. I was too young to understand the layers to why he might have done that. 3 years later, Michael walked into our lives. He wasn't just another guy Mom was seeing. He was the guy, at least according to her. I didn't know what to think of him at first. I was 11, awkward and still adjusting to life without Dad. Michael seemed fine, I guess. He was charming, knew how to make Mom laugh. But there was something about him that felt off. He moved in quickly after their wedding, taking over parts of the house like it was his from day one. He'd talk about fixing this or renovating that, and I'd bite my tongue, thinking, this isn't even your house. What irritated me most was the way he acted like Dad had never existed. All the stuff Dad had built, shelves, the porch swing, even the wooden clock in the hallway, Michael treated it like junk. One day, I came home from school and the swing was gone. It was rotting, Michael said casually when I asked. I'll build a new one. Spoiler, he never did. The first major crack in Michael's image came when I was 14. It was late, and I couldn't sleep. I heard Michael on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in a hushed tone. Curious, I tiptoed down the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky spots. He was saying something about a deed and papers not being ready yet. I froze. My heart started pounding. The deed? To the house? My house? I leaned closer, trying to catch more, but he must have sensed he wasn't alone because he abruptly ended the call. When I asked him about it the next morning, he brushed me off. Just business stuff, Jaden. Nothing for you to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying. From that moment on, I started watching him more closely. It wasn't long before I noticed other things. Little things. Michael was always digging through drawers and files, asking weird questions about the house. Once, he asked me if I had ever seen the original documents for the property. You're the legal owner, right? He'd said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Must feel good to have something so important in your name. It felt less like a compliment and more like he was fishing for something. If I tried to talk to Mom about it, she'd shut me down immediately. Michael's trying his best, Jaden. He loves us. Why can't you just give him a chance? She was so blinded by her love for him, or maybe her need to feel secure, that she refused to see what was right in front of her. Michael wasn't just nosy. He was calculated. One day, I came home to find him in my dad's office. That room was practically sacred to me. It was the one place in the house that still felt like Dad's. Michael was rifling through drawers when I walked in. He jumped, startled, and tried to play it off. Oh, hey, Jaden. I was just looking for a screwdriver. In Dad's files? I shot back, my voice colder than I intended. He stammered something about mistaking the drawer, but I didn't believe him. After that, I started locking the office whenever I wasn't home. The breaking point came a few months later. I was 16, and Michael had been in our lives for 5 years by then. I was cleaning out the attic when I stumbled across a box of papers I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was just old tax stuff or receipts, but then I found a document with Michael's name on it. My stomach dropped. It was a letter from a lawyer referencing a plan to contest ownership of the house. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to confront Michael, but I knew he'd just deny everything. Instead, I took the letter to Mom. I'll never forget her reaction. She looked at it, then at me, and then she started laughing. You think Michael's trying to steal the house? She said, like the idea was absurd. Jaden, he loves us. He's not capable of something like this. I could see I wasn't going to get through to her, so I dropped it. But I kept the letter. I hid it in my room, just in case. A few weeks later, Michael cornered me in the hallway. I know you've been snooping, he said, his voice low and threatening. You need to stay out of things you don't understand. I stood my ground. I know what you're doing. You're trying to take the house. He laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. This house isn't yours, Jaden. It's Catherine's. Always has been. No, I shot back. It's mine. Dad left it to me. For a moment, his mask slipped. His expression turned dark, and I saw the real Michael. We'll see about that, he said before walking away. From that point on, it was a game of cat and mouse. I started digging into Michael's past, trying to find anything I could use against him. What I found shocked me. He had been married before, twice in fact, and both relationships ended badly. In both cases, he had tried to claim ownership of his ex-wife's property. It was a pattern. I brought this information to Mom, but she still wouldn't listen. People can change, she said defensively. Michael's not like that anymore. But I wasn't so sure. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything Michael said and did. I even installed a small camera in the office to catch him if he tried to snoop again. The final straw came when I overheard Michael talking to a real estate agent on the phone. He was trying to list the house, my house, without my permission. I confronted him right then and there, and it turned into a shouting match. Mom tried to intervene, but I wouldn't let her. This has gone on long enough, I said. I'm calling a lawyer. Michael's reaction was explosive. He started yelling, accusing me of being ungrateful and disrespectful, but I didn't care. For the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. I'll stop here for now. There's a lot more to this story, but I need to gather my thoughts. If anyone has advice, I'd love to hear it. I feel like I'm in over my head, but I'm not giving up. This house is all I have left of my dad, and I'm not going to let Michael take it away from me. When I was 20, I thought things couldn't get worse between Michael and me. Turns out, I was wrong. It was a random Saturday afternoon when Michael sat me down in the living room. I remember it vividly because he had that smug expression he wore when he thought he was being clever. Mom hovered in the kitchen, pretending not to listen but clearly eavesdropping. Jaden, you're turning 21 soon, Michael began, leaning back in his chair like he was delivering some great wisdom. You're an adult now. It's time to start contributing. I squinted at him, confused. Contributing to what? To the house. You've been living here rent-free for years. Once you're officially an adult, you'll need to pay rent if you want to stay here. I laughed, assuming he was joking. What? Rent? I own this house, Michael. His smirk disappeared, replaced by a blank stare. Excuse me? The house is mine. Dad left it to me when he died. You know that. For a moment, the room was dead silent. Then Michael laughed, a short, humorless sound. You've got to be kidding me, Jaden. This is Catherine's house. I've been managing everything around here. I've been paying the bills, fixing things. You've been pretending. I cut him off. This house was left to me in Dad's will. I let you stay here because of Mom. But if you're serious about this rent thing, maybe it's time we clear up some things. Mom came rushing in then, her hands still wet from washing dishes. Jaden, what are you talking about? She said, her voice edged with panic. Michael's right. He's taken care of us all these years. The least you can do is… No, Mom. I stood up, my hands shaking. I'm not going to pay rent on my own house. This isn't up for discussion. Michael stood up too, his face red. You're delusional, kid. This house is ours. You're just living here out of kindness. That's when it hit me. He didn't just think he had some claim to the house. He actually believed it was his. Or at least he wanted me to believe that. I stormed out before the argument could escalate, but the damage was done. For days, the atmosphere in the house was unbearable. Mom avoided me, and Michael acted like he owned the place even more than usual. I knew I couldn't let this slide, so I started digging. I needed proof, something that would shut him up for good. I spent hours going through the old boxes in the attic, looking for anything related to the house's ownership. That's when I found the will. It was tucked away in a box labeled Dad's Stuff, along with old family photos and a few handwritten letters. The will was clear. The house was mine, explicitly left to me in my father's handwriting. I felt a strange mix of relief and anger as I held the document. This was it. My proof. Michael couldn't argue with this. But things took a turn I didn't expect. The next morning, I went downstairs with the will in hand, ready to confront Michael and Mom. I found them in the kitchen, talking in hushed tones. When I walked in, they both fell silent. Michael gave me a look I didn't like, cold and calculating. I found Dad's will, I said, placing it on the table. It clearly states the house is mine. So, unless you have some other magical document saying otherwise, this conversation is over. Michael didn't even look at the will. Instead, he smirked and said, That's not the original, Jaden. I blinked. What? That's a copy, he said, leaning back in his chair. Anyone could have printed that out. Do you have the official, notarized version? Because without that, this doesn't mean anything. My heart sank. I hadn't even thought about that. Was this just a copy? Where was the original? I looked to Mom, hoping she'd back me up, but she just looked away. Mom? I said, my voice trembling. You've seen the will, right? You know Dad left the house to me. She hesitated for a moment, then said, Jaden, maybe it's time to let this go. Michael's been taking care of everything. Do you really want to tear the family apart over a house? I I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This isn't about tearing the family apart, Mom. It's about what's right. Dad wanted me to have this house. Are you really going to let Michael steal it from me? She didn't answer. Instead, she walked out of the room, leaving me alone with Michael. He leaned forward, his smirk widening. You don't have a leg to stand on, kid. If I were you, I'd start looking for an apartment. I wanted to punch him. Instead, I grabbed the will and stormed back upstairs. I knew I couldn't handle this on my own. I needed help. That's when I called my dad's old friend, Greg. Greg was a lawyer, and he'd been close to my dad before he passed. I explained everything to him over the phone, from the will to Michael's threats. Greg didn't hesitate. Bring me everything you have, he said. We'll figure this out. I met with Greg the next day, handing over the will and explaining the situation in more detail. He looked it over, nodding thoughtfully. This is definitely a copy, he said. But that doesn't mean the original doesn't exist. Do you know where your dad might have kept important documents? I thought about it. Dad had always been meticulous about his records. If the original will was anywhere, it had to be in the house. But I'd already searched everywhere I could think of. Unless… Wait, I said, a memory surfacing. There's a safe in the basement. Dad used to keep it locked, and I never knew the combination. Greg's eyes lit up. That could be it. Can you get into it? I'll find a way, I said, determined. That night, I went down to the basement and stared at the old, dusty safe. It was bolted to the floor, and the combination lock looked ancient. I tried a few random numbers, but nothing worked. Frustrated, I sat back and tried to think. Then I remembered something. Dad used to say that his lucky number was 21, the age he met Mom. I tried it, 21-21-21. The lock clicked open. Inside, I found a stack of documents, including the original will. My hands shook as I pulled it out, tears welling up in my eyes. This was it, the proof I needed. But just as I was about to head back upstairs, I heard footsteps. I turned to see Michael standing at the top of the basement stairs, his face twisted with anger. What are you doing down here? He demanded. I held up the will. I found the original. Game over, Michael. His face darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might actually come down the stairs and try to take it from me. But then he smirked and said, We'll see about that. I didn't sleep that night. I knew Michael wouldn't give up easily, and I was right. The next morning, he and Mom were already waiting for me in the living room. Mom looked like she'd been crying, but Michael was calm, too calm. We need to talk, he said, motioning for me to sit down. Your mother and I have decided that it's time for you to move out. I laughed bitterly. You can't kick me out of my own house. Oh, but I can, Michael said. Legally, you're just a tenant until this whole ownership thing is resolved. And as the man of this house, I'm making the decision. You're insane, I said, standing up. This house isn't yours. It never was, and it never will be. Michael didn't respond. He just smiled, and I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When Michael found out the truth about the house, I thought he was going to explode. But to my surprise, he didn't. Instead, he froze, standing in the middle of the living room with a stunned look on his face. For a moment, it was almost satisfying to see him speechless. Michael, the man who always had a comeback, looked genuinely confused. Humiliated, even. Jaden, he started, his voice unusually soft. This isn't what you think. I crossed my arms, holding the original will like a shield. It's exactly what I think, Michael. You've been lying to me and Mom for years. You knew this house was mine. He shook his head, as if trying to clear it. No, that's not it. I didn't know. His voice cracked a little, and for the first time, I saw cracks in his usually confident facade. I thought it was Catherine's. I swear, I didn't. Cut the crap, I snapped, my frustration boiling over. You tried to kick me out of my own house. You knew exactly what you were doing. Michael ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room like a caged animal. Look, he said finally, turning to face me, this was never about the house. I was trying to prepare you for the real world, Jaden. You're turning 21. You need to understand responsibility. Paying rent, contributing to the household, that's part of growing up. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Responsibility? Are you serious? You wanted me to pay you rent for my house. That's not preparing me for adulthood. That's just manipulation. Michael's face turned red, and for a second, I thought he might yell. But then he did something even more shocking. He laughed. A short, bitter laugh. You don't get it, do you? He said, shaking his head. You've had everything handed to you, Jaden. This house, your life. You've never had to work for anything. I stared at him, dumbfounded. Are you seriously trying to make me the bad guy here? My dad left me this house because he wanted me to have something after he was gone. And my voice broke. You've been trying to take that away from me since the day you moved in. At that moment, Mom walked into the room, her face pale. What's going on? She asked, her voice trembling. She looked at Michael, then at me, and then at the will in my hands. Jaden, what are you doing with that? I found it, I said, my voice firm. The original will. It proves the house belongs to me. Mom's eyes darted to Michael, who looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Michael, she said, her voice rising. Is this true? Did you know about this? He hesitated for just a moment too long. I didn't know, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. I thought the house was ours. You thought? Mom repeated, her voice sharp. Michael, how could you not know? We've been living here for years. I wasn't trying to steal anything, Michael said quickly, holding up his hands like he was surrendering. I was just trying to teach Jaden some responsibility. That's all. Mom turned to me, her eyes filled with doubt. Jaden, is that what this is about? Responsibility? No, Mom, I said, my voice trembling with anger. This is about Michael trying to take something that doesn't belong to him. He wanted me to pay rent to him for my own house. And now he's pretending it was all some life lesson. Mom's face fell, and for a moment, she just stood there, staring at Michael like she didn't recognize him. Is that true? She asked him quietly. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the doorbell rang. We all froze. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out. Finally, Mom walked over and opened the door. Standing there was a man I didn't recognize, tall, in his late 40s, with a sharp suit and an even sharper expression. Good evening, the man said, stepping into the house without waiting for an invitation. I'm Alan Rivers, Michael's business associate. Business associate? I repeated, frowning. What business? Michael looked like he wanted to crawl under a rock. Alan, he said quickly, this isn't a good time. Alan ignored him, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. You must be Jaden, he said, extending a hand. I've heard a lot about you. I didn't shake his hand. What's this about? Alan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It's about the house, he said smoothly. Michael and I were working on a deal to sell it. He didn't tell me it wasn't his to sell. The room went completely silent. What? Mom whispered, turning to Michael. Is this true? Michael didn't respond. He just stared at the floor, his face pale. Alan, on the other hand, looked completely unfazed. I assume this complicates things, he said, pulling out a folder and flipping through some papers. We were in the final stages of the sale. The buyer was very interested. I felt like I was going to be sick. You were going to sell the house? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Without telling me? I didn't think it would get this far, Michael mumbled, finally looking up. I thought. You thought what? I yelled. That you could just take everything my dad left me and sell it to the highest bidder? Mom looked like she was about to collapse. Michael, she said, her voice shaking. How could you do this? How could you lie to me? It wasn't like that, Michael said quickly, his voice desperate. I was trying to help us, Catherine. We've been struggling financially, and this house is worth a lot of money. I thought. You thought you could steal from my son? Mom interrupted, her voice rising. This is his house, Michael. Not yours. Not ours. His. Alan cleared his throat. Well, this is clearly a family matter, he said, sliding the folder back into his briefcase. I'll leave you to it. But for the record, this kind of mess is bad for business. He shot Michael a cold look before walking out the door. As soon as he was gone, the house erupted into chaos. Mom was yelling. Michael was trying to defend himself, and I was just standing there, trying to process everything. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the will and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I needed to get out of there. The truth was out, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like my whole world had been turned upside down. All I could think about was what Dad would say if he were here. Would he be proud of me for standing up for myself? Or would he be heartbroken to see what our family had become? Either way, one thing was clear. I couldn't trust Michael. Not anymore. I barely slept that night. The house felt suffocating, and every creak or groan from the old wood made me jump, as if Michael was lurking outside my door. I kept replaying the events of the day in my head. The will, Michael's lies, Alan's unexpected visit. By the time the sun came up, I'd made up my mind. If Michael wanted to play games, I'd show him I wasn't some kid he could push around. The smell of coffee greeted me as I walked into the kitchen. Mom was at the stove, flipping pancakes, her movements stiff and robotic. Michael sat at the table, scrolling through his phone, acting as if nothing had happened. His casual demeanor made my blood boil. "Morning," I said, forcing a calmness into my voice that I didn't feel. Mom glanced at me briefly, her face lined with exhaustion. "Morning, Jaden. Pancakes?" "No, thanks," I said, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from Michael. He barely looked up, but I could feel the tension radiating off him. "Good. I've been thinking," I said, keeping my tone neutral, "about the whole rent thing." That got his attention. He set his phone down and raised an eyebrow. "Oh, yeah," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You're right, Michael. People should contribute if they're living in someone else's house. It's only fair." Mom turned around, her spatula hovering over the pan. "Jaden, what are you talking about?" "I'm saying," I continued, ignoring her for the moment, "that if you and Mom want to stay here after I turn 21, you're going to need to start paying rent." Michael blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I said, crossing my arms. $2,500 a month. Starting next month." Mom dropped the spatula, and it clattered against the stove. "Jaden, what are you doing?" "I'm being responsible," I said, throwing Michael's own words back at him. "If I'm old enough to pay rent, then so are you. After all, you've been living here for free for years. It's time to contribute." Michael's face turned red. "That's ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "This is our home too." "No, it's not," I shot back. "It's my home. Legally. You're the one who made it about money, so I'm just following your lead." For a moment, I thought he might actually flip the table. Instead, he stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. "You're being childish," he spat. "This is just some petty revenge because you didn't like me asking you to grow up." "You're the one who needs to grow up," I said, standing as well. "You lied to me. You tried to sell the house behind my back. And now you're mad because you're being held to the same standards you tried to push on me? Give me a break." "Enough." Mom's voice cut through the room like a whip. She looked between the two of us, her face pale. "This has gone far enough. Jaden, sit down." I hesitated, but eventually I sank back into my chair. Michael did the same, though his hands were clenched into fists on the table. "Look," Mom said, her voice trembling. "I know things have been tense lately, but we're a family. We need to figure this out together." "There's nothing to figure out," I said. "Either you pay rent, or you find somewhere else to live." "Jaden." Mom sounded genuinely shocked, but I didn't care. For years, I'd kept my mouth shut, letting Michael walk all over me and twist the narrative. Not anymore. Michael leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Just because you have a piece of paper that says the house is yours?" "It's not just a piece of paper," I said, meeting his glare. "It's the law. And if you don't like it, you're free to leave." Before he could respond, the front door slammed. All three of us turned to see my cousin Lisa walking in, her face red with anger. She'd heard about the drama from my aunt and had come over to see if I was okay. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her eyes darting between me, Mom, and Michael. "Nothing," Michael said quickly, but Lisa wasn't buying it. "Don't nothing me," she snapped. "Aunt Carol told me everything." "Michael, you're unbelievable. Trying to sell Jaden's house? Are you out of your mind?" Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Lisa turned to me. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, though my hands were still shaking from the confrontation. "Good," she said, planting herself in the doorway like a bouncer. "Because if this guy tries anything else, he's going to have to deal with me." Michael let out a bitter laugh. "Great. Another person sticking their nose where it doesn't belong." Lisa ignored him. "Jaden, if you need help with anything, lawyers, paperwork, whatever, you let me know. I've got your back." "Thanks," I said, grateful for the support. The rest of the morning was a blur. Michael stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Mom tried to play peacemaker, but I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. By the time Lisa left, I was emotionally drained. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. Michael wasn't the type to back down easily, and I knew he'd try something else. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand. And I wasn't going to let him take that away from me. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps pacing the hallway. I could already tell it was Michael, His nervous energy was practically vibrating through the walls. I sighed, bracing myself for another round of conflict. Last night's proposal had clearly rattled him, and I had no doubt he was gearing up to confront me about it. When I stepped into the kitchen, Michael was already there, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee in one hand. His jaw was clenched, and he looked up as soon as I walked in. "We need to talk," he said, skipping any pretense of small talk. "Good morning to you too," I said, grabbing a glass of water and sitting at the table. Michael didn't sit down. He stayed standing, looming over me like he thought his height would give him the upper hand. "What the hell was that stunt you pulled yesterday?" "Stunt?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "You mean asking you to pay rent? That wasn't a stunt. That was me being fair." "Fair?" Michael let out a bitter laugh, slamming his coffee mug onto the counter. "You think charging your own family $2,500 a month is fair? That's insane, Jaden. Family doesn't do that to each other." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Family doesn't try to kick each other out of their own house either, or sell it behind their back. So, forgive me if I'm not feeling particularly charitable. Michael's face turned red, and he opened his mouth to retort but then hesitated, like he was searching for the right words. "This is different," he said finally. "I was trying to help you grow up, teach you responsibility." "Oh, spare me the lecture," I interrupted. "You weren't trying to teach me anything, Michael. You wanted control. You thought you could intimidate me into giving up my own house. And now that the tables have turned, you don't like it." "That's not true." Michael shot back, his voice rising. "I've been taking care of this family for years. I've been paying the bills, fixing things around the house." "Fixing things?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Like what? The porch swing you got rid of and never replaced? The shelves Dad built that you called junk? Face it, Michael. You've been mooching off me and Mom this whole time." Michael's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He was clearly struggling to come up with a response, and I could see the frustration boiling over in his eyes. "You're stubborn, you know that," he said finally, pointing a finger at me. "You're just a selfish, spoiled little brat who doesn't appreciate everything I've done for this family." "Selfish?" I repeated, my voice rising to match his. "You're calling me selfish? You're the one who tried to sell a house that doesn't even belong to you. You've been living here rent-free for years, Michael. If anyone's selfish, it's you." Michael looked like he was about to explode, but before he could say anything else, Mom walked into the kitchen. She froze when she saw us, her eyes darting between the two of us like she'd walked into the middle of a battlefield. "What's going on?" she asked cautiously. "Jaden's being ridiculous," Michael said, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "He's trying to charge us rent. $2,500 a month, Catherine. Can you believe that?" Mom looked at me, her expression a mix of confusion and exhaustion. "Jaden, is that true?" "Yes," I said bluntly. "Michael thinks it's fair for me to pay rent, so I'm holding him to the same standard. If he wants to stay here, he can pay. Simple as that." "Jaden, this is your family," Mom said, her voice pleading. "We shouldn't be charging each other rent. That's not how families work." "Exactly," Michael chimed in, clearly relieved that Mom was taking his side. I turned to her, trying to keep my voice calm. "Mom, I love you, but you need to stop enabling him. Michael has been taking advantage of us for years. This house is mine. It's been mine since Dad died. I shouldn't have to fight for what's already mine." Mom's face crumpled, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then Michael spoke again, and any sympathy I might have felt disappeared. "This is absurd," he muttered, shaking his head. "I'm not paying rent to live in my own home." "It's not your home," I said firmly. "It never was." Michael glared at me, his jaw tightening. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "If that's how you want to play it, go ahead. Be stubborn. But don't come crying to me when this all blows up in your face." With that, he stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, and for a moment, neither Mom nor I said anything. Finally, she broke the silence. "Jaden," she said quietly, "do you really think this is the best way to handle things?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know, Mom, but I'm tired of being treated like a doormat. Michael needs to understand that this house isn't his. It never was." Mom didn't respond. She just stood there, looking lost. I felt a pang of guilt again, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't back down now. Later that day, my cousin Lisa showed up again, uninvited but very much welcome. She had a knack for showing up at just the right time, and this was no exception. "I heard about the breakfast drama," she said as she plopped down on the couch. How's Michael taking it? Not well, I admitted, sitting across from her. He called me stubborn and stormed out. Lisa snorted. Classic Michael. He can dish it out, but he can't take it. We spent the next hour talking, and by the end of it, I felt a little better. Lisa always had a way of putting things into perspective, and she reminded me that standing up for myself wasn't a bad thing. Still, I knew the fight was far from over. Michael wasn't the type to let things go, and I had no doubt he was already plotting his next move. But for now, I was ready. He could call me stubborn all he wanted. I wasn't backing down. After Michael stormed out of the kitchen that morning, Mom didn't say much. She looked torn, caught between me and him, but for the first time in years, she didn't leap to his defense. That should have been comforting, but the silence was almost worse. I knew she had something to say, but instead of saying it, she just quietly went back to cooking. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. I avoided the kitchen for the rest of the day. I knew Mom needed time to process everything, and honestly, so did I. But later that night, when the house was quiet and I was sitting in my room, the knock on my door told me she was ready to talk. Jaden? Mom's voice was soft, almost hesitant. Can I come in? I sighed and set down the notebook I'd been scribbling in. Yeah, sure. She opened the door and stepped inside, closing it gently behind her. She was wearing her usual robe and slippers, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. But her face looked tired, more tired than I'd ever seen it. She sat down on the edge of my bed, smoothing the fabric of her robe like she needed something to do with her hands. I wanted to talk to you about what happened this morning, she said finally. Figured as much, I said, leaning back in my chair. Go ahead. She hesitated, like she was trying to find the right words. I think you were too harsh on Michael, she said, her voice cautious. I understand why you're upset, and I agree that what he said about charging you rent was wrong. But asking him to pay that much, Jaden, it's not realistic. It's not fair. I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. Fair? You're seriously talking to me about fairness? After everything Michael's done? She held up a hand. Let me finish. I'm not saying he was right. He wasn't. But you're putting me in an impossible position here. You're asking me to choose between you and him. I'm not asking you to choose, I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts. I'm asking you to see the truth. Michael has been lying to us for years, Mom. He tried to sell the house. He tried to kick me out of my own home. And now, when I hold him accountable, you're telling me I'm the one being unfair. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away. It's not that simple, Jaden. I love Michael. He's my husband. But I love you too. And seeing you two at each other's throats like this, it's breaking my heart. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to yell, to tell her that Michael didn't deserve her loyalty. But another part of me felt guilty. She was stuck in the middle of a fight she didn't start, and I hated that she was hurting because of it. I'm sorry, Mom, I said finally, my voice softer. I don't want to hurt you, but I can't let Michael walk all over me anymore. I've put up with it for too long. She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. I know, and I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. But please, Jaden, don't let this tear our family apart. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. We both froze, exchanging a confused look. It was almost 9 p.m. Who would be visiting this late? I'll get it, I said, standing up, but Mom followed me, her worry etched into her face. When I opened the door, I was met with a face I didn't recognize. A young woman, probably in her late 20s, stood on the porch. She had dark hair tied into a neat ponytail and carried a leather bag slung over her shoulder. Her expression was serious, almost businesslike. Can I help you? I asked, frowning. Are you Jaden? She asked, glancing behind me at Mom. Yeah, I said slowly. Who's asking? My name's Erica, she said, holding out a hand. I'm an attorney. Michael hired me. My stomach dropped. What? Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Michael hired a lawyer? For what? Erica hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details, but I've been asked to deliver this. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, handing it to me. I took it, my hands shaking slightly. What is this? It's a notice of intent, Erica said. Michael is contesting your ownership of the house. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Mom staggered back, clutching the doorframe for support. He's doing what? She whispered. I'm sorry, Erica said, her voice softening. I know this is a difficult situation, but I suggest you find legal representation as soon as possible. She nodded politely, then turned and walked away, leaving us standing there in stunned silence. What the hell is wrong with him? I muttered, ripping open the envelope. Inside was a letter outlining Michael's claim that the house should belong to him and Mom, citing contributions to the household as justification. Mom took the letter from me, her eyes scanning the page. When she looked up, she was pale. Jaden, I had no idea he was going to do this. I swear. I believe you, I said, though the anger in my chest was threatening to explode. But this is war. That night, I called Lisa and told her everything. She showed up within the hour, armed with coffee and a notepad. We need a plan, she said, her tone all business. Michael just crossed a line, and we're not letting him get away with it. Over the next few days, things in the house went from bad to worse. Michael avoided me completely, but I could feel his presence like a dark cloud hanging over everything. Mom tried to play peacemaker, but it was clear she was just as lost as I was. Meanwhile, Lisa and I started gathering evidence. Copies of the will, records of the mortgage payments Dad had made, anything that proved the house was mine. One evening, as Lisa and I were going through old paperwork in the living room, Michael walked in. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes narrowing when he saw us. "What are you two up to?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. "None of your business," Lisa shot back without looking up. Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. He just stood there for a moment, glaring at us, before turning and walking away. "Coward," Lisa muttered under her breath. Despite the tension, having Lisa around was a huge comfort. She reminded me that I wasn't alone in this fight, and her confidence gave me the strength to keep pushing forward. But I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get even messier, and I was right. Because the next morning, Erica showed up again. This time with a stack of legal documents and a warning that Michael was planning to escalate the case. Mom was devastated, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into an abyss. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. This was my house, my home, and I would do whatever it took to protect it. It was a week after Erica delivered Michael's legal notice, and the house had become unbearable. Mom walked on eggshells, trying to keep the peace, while Michael avoided me entirely. We were 3 people living under the same roof, pretending not to notice the storm brewing between us. Even Lisa's regular visits couldn't keep me from feeling the weight of it all. I hated the fighting, but more than that, I hated what it was doing to Mom. She looked thinner, like the stress was eating away at her. I knew I needed to try something different. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and going over the numbers Lisa and I had compiled. Every bill, every receipt for repairs Dad had paid for. It was all there, neatly organized and undeniable proof that Michael's claims were baseless. But even with all the evidence in my favor, I couldn't shake the feeling that dragging this out in court would only make things worse. Maybe there was another way to settle this. When Mom walked into the kitchen, she gave me a tired smile. "Morning," she said, her voice quiet. "Morning," I replied, watching as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Her hands trembled slightly, and I felt a pang of guilt. This fight with Michael was taking a toll on her too. "Where's Michael?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the doorway as if he might walk in at any moment. "He's in the garage," she said finally. "Fixing something, I think." I nodded, setting my mug down. "I want to talk to you both. Together. Can you ask him to come in?" Mom looked at me warily. "Jaden, are you sure that's a good idea?" "It's not about fighting," I said quickly, hoping to reassure her. "I just think we need to try a different approach. This can't keep going the way it has." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, I'll get him." A few minutes later, Michael walked into the kitchen, his expression guarded. He didn't sit down, choosing instead to lean against the counter with his arms crossed. Mom sat across from me, wringing her hands nervously. "What is this?" Michael asked, his tone sharp. "Another lecture?" "No," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I want to talk." "Just talk." Michael raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but he didn't interrupt. I took a deep breath and began. "Look," I said, glancing between him and Mom. "This isn't working. The fighting, the tension, it's tearing this family apart. And I don't want that. I don't think any of us do." Mom nodded quickly, her eyes filling with tears. Michael, on the other hand, remained stone-faced. "I know things got heated," I continued, "and I know I've been stubborn. But the truth is, I don't want to kick you out. That was never my goal." Michael's expression softened slightly, though he still didn't say anything. "I get it," I said, leaning forward. "You've been here for years. This house feels like home to you too. And I'm not trying to take that away. But we need to find a way to make this work. For all of us. Michael frowned, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting a compromise, I said. Instead of rent, we come up with a system where you help out with utility bills and repairs. Things that directly benefit the house. That way, you're contributing, and it's fair for everyone. Mom let out a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Michael, however, still looked uncertain. So what? He asked. You want us to pay for the water bill and fix the leaky faucet? That's it. It's a start, I said. It's better than what we're doing now, which is nothing but fighting. Michael stared at me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing like he was searching for some hidden motive. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I don't like this, he said, his voice low. But I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking, I said, relief washing over me. Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Thank you, Jaden, she said, her voice trembling. Thank you for trying. Michael didn't stick around for much longer. He muttered something about needing air and walked out the back door, leaving Mom and me alone in the kitchen. Do you think he'll go for it? I asked her. She hesitated, then nodded. I think so. He's stubborn, but he knows this can't keep going the way it has. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely convinced. Michael's pride had always been his biggest obstacle, and I knew getting him to agree to anything was going to be a challenge. Still, it felt like a small step in the right direction. Later that evening, Lisa came over, as she often did. I filled her in on the conversation, and she gave me a skeptical look. You really think Michael's going to stick to this? She asked, leaning against the counter. I don't know, I admitted. But I have to try. Lisa nodded, though her expression remained doubtful. Just be careful, okay? He's not exactly the most reliable person. I know, I said, sighing. But this can't keep going like this. Mom's falling apart, and honestly, so am I. Lisa softened at that, reaching out to squeeze my shoulder. You're doing the right thing, Jaden. Even if it doesn't work out, at least you can say you tried. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in weeks, the house felt a little less heavy. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward.